So we are getting started on what will be a fascinating phase of needs assessment. So I am going to take you through the process, and it's not something really new to you, but we're going to be adding some definitions, and we're going to be also talking about some concepts that you probably use today, but they are going to be a little bit more organized, and we are going to put them or mesh them up with theory. So that's part of what we're going to do in this session. So the high points of this particular module is for us to define the needs. That's really our starting point. And once we have defined the needs, we're going to describe the needs assessment as a model as well as the process. And then, of course, we're going to explore the types of needs assessments. And so from that point, you're going to have a good starting springboard to begin your project for this class. So let's begin with the needs. I like to usually deconstruct it to the very basic level. So if you look at the needs from two perspectives, as a noun, it's essentially the gap between what it is and what it should be. I personally like to always say the gap between point A and point B. Point A is what is happening today in a company. Point B is what we would like it to be in the future. But if we use the needs as a verb, then it's the thing that fills the gap, if you will. And a couple of examples. We need a diversity recruitment program. We need reduction of errors in entering data. We need more widget production per hour, etc. And what is the needs assessment going to do? Now that we have talked a little bit about the needs as a noun and as a verb, which we will use in both ways. So it's the needs analysis or the needs assessment, and you will hear me use both terms or phrases exchangeably because it is usually the same process that we're going to use, is going to help us lead the actions that will result in change, that will ultimately give us improvement in considering the gap between what it is and what should be. So I'm going to make a quick pause before getting into these three definitions. When you are in a company, one of the things that you are going to realize is that the needs assessment or the needs analysis is usually going to be an exercise that is going to be focused on production or productivity. So the one thing that I like to remove us from for just a second before we start diving full force into this topic is to think about the process itself, where sometimes we are conducting our personal lives and we can do needs analysis or needs assessments then before even getting to a work environment. But in a company, one of the challenges is that usually the people performing needs assessments are usually people in learning. And so by definition, any type of needs analysis ends up prescribing a learning solution. And I'd like to remove that lens for just a second and make you aware that we need to look at it from a performance improvement perspective. So it's not that we're going to go in exclusively to figure out what training is needed, and some people do see it that way, and you will hear some videos that usually they start talking about the need usually is solved with training, and that's not necessarily true. I have had many years of experience where learning is not the solution, or it's not the solution for the need, or it's just simply not the need. So think about that for a minute. Now that we have talked a little bit about that, let's think about what the needs assessment really does. So number one, it examines and frames problems, opportunities, and the potential solutions that a company can experience or need to increase in their industry. Also, the needs assessment process helps us identify and compare the prioritization of things that can help us to get to that point B, if you think about it. And also, it helps us determine how to close that gap, which one thing is to know that there is a need, so we have to validate it. Yep, there is a need, we feel it. Oh, and by the way, the need is caused by XYZ. Oh, and here are some solutions that you can use. Sometimes, if you think about it, I like to think about jujitsu. It's one of those martial arts that sometimes you don't use your force, you use the opponent's force or synergy. It's the same thing in a needs analysis. Sometimes we go through the process of figuring out what the need is, and sometimes just the pure process of identifying the need is going to sometimes help solve the problem. Being aware of the need is essentially the problem, and that is the solution in and of itself. But generally, it's more complex than that, sadly to say. But that's one thing that I like us to keep in mind. So, as far as a model, and this is extracted from another book that we don't have, and that's why I wanted to share it with you. It's more of a graphical model. So, the present, or what it is, or as I told you, point A, where things are. What are we doing today? What is productivity looking like? What are people doing? What are their skills? What is the company's direction going to right now? Etc. On the right hand side, you see the future, and that is what a lot of people have a difficult time verbalizing. So when we come in as consultants to try to do a needs assessment or a needs analysis, we have a difficult time figuring out that gap because we cannot hear clearly what the future state should be or what point B is. And sometimes we do have to help our clients figure even that out. Once we have those two, you see in the center of the screen, we have the gap, or what it really is, the need. This is at some point what we need to formulate recommendations for or have our executive summary describing what it is. Now I like to present you with an enhanced model. So we have the traditional, the present and the future, what it is, what it should be, or points A and B. But then we include a process or step 4 in the process, which is selecting the right solution. And that's why I was saying earlier, it not always will be learning. And so that's what we have to keep in mind. So when we go through this experience, please think about, we're going to find point A, or what it is. We're going to try to figure out what point B should be by means of asking our clients or observations, etc. And then determine what is the difference, what is going to be needed to take us from A to B. Once we get there, then we have to formulate that solution, and that is the final report. So I'll tell you more a little bit about that in a second. But first, let me just finish talking about the needs. And this is not necessarily how we're going to use it in class, but this is going to give you an idea. So you are familiar with Maslow, right? So we have seen this triangle, gosh, probably since elementary school, maybe high school, perhaps. I don't even remember when I started seeing it, but it has been with me for a long time. And so the whole premise of this pyramid, obviously, is the psychological needs are the basis of our existence. And then, of course, we continue to go and elevate the needs. The self-actualization, as you can see, is at the top. So the premise is, as long as we have the psychological needs fulfilled, then we can move on and find the solution for the needs on the self-actualization and everything in between, of course, in that order. Psychologically, though, one of the things that we as needs analysis consultants or needs assessors have a problem is with clients expressing really where they lie on their need. And usually it's not at a personal level, usually. But sometimes it is, and that's where we have to be careful too. So how does this translate to the types of needs that we're going to deal with? Let's talk a little bit about the types of needs. So we have 4. The very first one is strategic needs. These are usually the ones that I refer to as the long-term or organizational needs. They are going to take quite a bit of time to fill, and sometimes they are aspirational because you're talking about moving the entire organization towards something different. So it may require a lot of workforce, a lot of money, a lot of time, we don't know, resources. Another level or type of need is the operational need, and that's a little bit more tactical. And what that means is something that is usually going to be fulfilled in a short term, definitely less than a year or potentially a year or less. It is usually competency based, so it's different than the organization as a whole and their aspiration to become a leading industry, a leading company in their industry, but it's more of a competency based. What are our competencies? If you think about Amazon, for example, how we have seen them transform. They started selling books, and then they started selling additional things, and now they pretty much sell everything. And not only that, but they also deliver it. They have their own supply chain division. So that's a competency that they have developed for each one of those businesses. So the organization as a whole has now subsystems or sub operations which are more tactical, and so each one of those is competency based. Another need is the individual or performance need, and here's where we start talking about people directly. So it's relative to the person's accomplishment, their behaviors, or the capacity to perform. Remember one thing: when we are hired to do a job, we usually are hired based on our accolades, based on our credentials. But that does not necessarily mean that we know exactly what that company does and how they do it. We may be an accountant, but every time we go to be hired for a company to keep the books, we're going to apply the basic standards for keeping a book, but we don't know what are their allocations, categories, departments, etc. And so that's where the gap begins, right? And so I refer to those as the job and task needs sometimes. Here's where people start diving into we need training. But remember, not always is going to be the case. And then, of course, we have the learning needs. That is a fact. Today, you are here completing a course because you want to complete a program, because you want to get a degree. As a part of that, you have a learning need, and that's why you are here with me today. And so the need, however, is not fully being assessed because I haven't spoken to each one of you to know exactly what it is that you are going to be needing. But the presumption is that we are here around knowledge and skills, which is what we are going to continue talking about. So, talking about that knowledge and skills, let me start with the knowledge. So, for a needs analysis, we have three phases. We have the exploration phase, which includes defining the purpose. Why are we doing this? Identify the major needs. Remember when I started talking about the organization, the operation, and so on and so forth? So we have to define what are those areas that we really want to get at. We have to then start locating the data. What is going to help us inform what is happening? What has been historically the case? What is affecting? What is influencing? Etc. So it's a lot of research. And we're going to also need to determine whether or not we need to conduct further needs analysis. Sometimes, some needs are so basic that looking at records will give us an answer or will define what the gap is and even a solution. So we have to keep in mind that not always we have to take this entire process full-fledged, okay? Once we have done the exploration, which is basically scratching the surface, if you will, then we get into the data gathering. Once we have determined that we do in fact need to continue exploring further because we don't have a clear vision of what the gap between point A and point B is, we need to do that data gathering. And so to do that, we have to establish boundaries. And to give you a relationship, are we going to interview people? Who are we going to interview? How long is it going to take us? Are we going to run a survey? How many surveys? How long? What is the frequency, etc. So that's when we have determined, yes, we need to continue exploring. We need more information. We need more input, as John F. I would say from a movie back in the 80s. So we also have to casually analyze the needs. And when I say casually, I mean when we are in the data gathering phase, unfortunately, we have the tendency to start running to conclusions and we try to start fixing or giving solutions or prescribing solutions. We can't do that just yet. We're still gathering the data. And then once we have that data, we need to begin the analysis of it. So when we have that analysis, which could be qualitative or quantitative, or it could be historical trending analysis type, at that point we can begin figuring out, okay, so there are 3 pieces, there are 4 pieces. You know, the gap by definition is one word. However, the gap could include a number of things, and that's why sometimes prioritization is necessary. And so once we have done that, and then we have done the analysis, then we get to that utilization factor or phase, which is where we set the final needs priorities. We say these are 5 things that are going to help us close the gap. The first 3 are definitely the most important ones. The last 2 are perhaps long-term or aspirational or etc. At that point, we can begin selecting solutions if we have come up with them. Usually, in a needs analysis, you will most likely find out what the potential solution may be. However, it won't be your job to decide which solution to apply because we are simply identifying the gap and the possible solutions. It is up to the client to decide how they want to spend their money or their time or their resources to close that gap. And of course, we have to design and implement the action plan. And this is because at this level, we are not necessarily running the entire company. We are just trying to help a client move forward. So usually we can give them a project plan, we can give them a strategic intent, etc. And of course, it would be ideal if we can implement, then to evaluate that implementation. But in some cases, we won't be able to do that. So when you look at these 3 phases, the exploration, the data gathering, and the utilization, it's almost like a funnel. The exploration is the immediate take in. You take it all. You hear from people, you hear history, you accept everything that you're hearing so you can begin categorizing it. Then you decide whether you need to know more, and that's when you go into more data gathering. Fresher, perhaps, more up-to-date data. You analyze it, and then you begin setting your priorities. Yes, this is important. This is something that has happened forever, so we're going to deal with it later. And of course, you get into the utilization, and that is precisely the closing of the exercise of the needs analysis, where now that you have had a comprehensive view, you have gathered data, you have analyzed it, now you can come back to your client and say, this is the result of my exercise, and this is what I recommend you do. But now it is up to you to do it. And by the way, here's a project plan on how you can accomplish that. So what we are going to do in this course, if you think about that last funnel that we had, I would like to say that the exploration is really our research. So what the phase 1 is going to be of our work is to figure out what the need is. For that, you have to find a client, you have to figure out what is the squeaky wheel of sorts. And so you can begin determining your point A and then begin doing interviews to figure out what the point B should be. We as needs assessors are not going to ever say what the point B should look like. We can make recommendations based on our research, but usually the client is the one that has to say, I am having 10 widgets produced today, I want 20. Can we do it? The gap is, can we increase the production by 10 widgets? So that is where the research comes in. So we're going to define what the ask is going to be. Increase productivity of widgets, yes or no? That's the basic, as an example. The second thing we're going to do, or the second part, is we're going to take the data that we collect and we're going to analyze it so that we can determine, yes, I am validating that there is in fact a need. You can produce and you should produce 20 or 10 more widgets. And the last piece, which would be your HAT or hallmark assessment, is pretty much presenting the resolution of it. You were asked to do a needs analysis, you gathered data, you defined it, you gathered data, you analyzed it, and you are giving a report back with possibly a project plan. So that translated to the research then becomes the part 1, or the pre-assessment and planning. Here's where in your paper you're going to tell me what the part A is, or the point A, when your client came to you and he or she or the number of clients said what point B should be, and you are going to determine whether or not you need more information. For the purposes of our class, I hope that the answer to that is yes, we need more information. Because if you don't have the need for more information, you can't do further analysis, you can't do an instrument design, And so in that case, you couldn't complete the other deliverables for this class. So make sure that you find something that it is more complex where you need more information. So because you will need more information once you have done that pre-assessment or planning phase, part 2 of our class deliverables is going to be the analysis tool, selection, and the analysis of the data. So at this point, you are going to also comprise a very short paper where you're going to tell me what tools you're going to use. I normally would recommend you do at least 2 forms of data gathering, and we'll talk a little bit later why we need that. But generally focus on 2, and it can be a mix and match depending on the need, not just because surveys are the chic thing to do, we're going to do surveys. No. Sometimes you have enough data that all you need to do is go on historical data research. Sometimes you need to interview people, etc. So it will depend. But that is part 2. And of course you have part 3, which is the whole tamale. At this point you bring parts 1 and 2, they become one paper. And the trail end of that paper will be essentially your recommendations. This is what my analysis told me. Therefore, yes, there is a need. It is this. And yes, this is how we can help fill that gap. And here's, by the way, a project plan or just an executive summary, etc. So that is essentially what we're going to do. Some ideas for you guys to start thinking about it. So past projects, some people have dealt with performance issues, decreased productivity, decreased customer satisfaction, low performance, length of delays at cosmetic counter, etc. Other needs are HR general issues, employee learning readiness, low engagement, oh, that's huge, Dr. Shuck would probably appreciate that. Turnover of long-term volunteer firefighters, that has actually been a project in the past. Delays in completing employee performance, etc., etc. So those are HR issues. And then of course you have operational issues like fundraising for a university hockey team. We don't have one at U of L, or do we? I know we have a basketball team and we have a football team, very good ones. And we have baseball and we have soccer and so on and so forth. But you get the idea. So those are some operational issues that you can get. And then of course, then there are the higher education issues. So if you are working for the university, thank you. And these are some things that you can find if you work for a community college or if you work for a high school or the like. Here are some things that you can figure out to use. So the next steps for us from this point forward is going to be to explore the approaches separately. So how are we going to deal with the strategic needs, and how are we going to deal with the competency needs, etc., etc. And of course, for you, I need you at this point to begin identifying the opportunity to define that point A and point B, what it is today and what it should be. So begin talking to your friends, clients. If your work of employment does have a need, perhaps you can lend a hand, raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to know more about XYZ. Let me see if we can figure out whether there is a need or not. So go ahead and get on that, and we will continue to meet in other series. Thank you everyone, and have a great day.